Welcome to PovPolPodcast, where we discuss a variety of current events and issues locally, provincially, nationally, and abroad about poverty or from a poverty lens. PovPolPodcast is proudly produced in Calgary, Alberta, on Treaty 7 land, and we acknowledge the land, traditions, history, and the people of our First Nations, Métis, and Inuit neighbors who reside here. So our first topic today is vocational training in schools. And a lot of this is caused by the fact that earlier this week, the government of Alberta announced that it would be allowing for charter schools to operate as vocational schools as young as kindergarten. Now, I still don't know all the details. I still haven't read the bill or the debate. So I'm trying to avoid making certain assumptions here. My understanding is that this is not for the public education system, but this is just for the private education system. And that because kids would be allowed to go to vocational as early as kindergarten doesn't necessarily mean they will. However, a couple of things that should be noted. It's usually in communist countries where you have your career decided for you as young as kindergarten. Secondly, this is another way of trying to ensure that the rich are put into an education system that give them the best possible jobs and advances, because this is only going to be applying to private charter schools. So daddy wants little Billy to grow up to be a banker. Well, little Billy's going to grow up to be a banker, by gum. And those are concerns. Obviously, those are like the extreme examples. But without checks and balances written into this bill, there's no guarantee that's not a possibility. I don't have a whole lot of faith in humanity, so I'm of the opinion that if you give humans an opportunity to do something stupid and reckless and selfish, they will. Because it'll seem like the greatest thing in the world to them. Now, just because kids will be allowed to enter vocational schools as young as kindergarten doesn't necessarily mean that they will be. And the other flip side to this is vocational doesn't necessarily imply that their job path will be set for them right from the beginning. There's some vocational training in the public school. People don't realize that in grade 7, every single student has to take cooking, sewing, woodworking, and I'm trying to remember what the fourth one is, but there are 4 classes that every single grade 7 student has to take, and they rotate through it throughout the year. And a lot of that is because we want to give them some kind of vocational training, some kind of trade, some kind of skill that can help put them on a career path. In fact, I remember we also did exams in grade 7 to help determine what kind of career path we would belong on to, as well as rank us against the other students. I came in the 91st percentile, which is pretty damn good. That means I was in like the top 10% of all Albertans who took this test. And I was also still taking those trades classes that I need to. And I can't remember what career it said that I would be set up for, or that I should be set up for. And that doesn't necessarily define your career path. Because, students change schools. In fact, right after I finished grade 7, the school that I was in for junior high turned into an art school, and I had to transfer schools anyways. So I want to be clear that I don't think we're going to be going in and saying, oh, 6-year-old little Johnny going into grade 1, he's got to be a banker because his tests show that he's going to be a banker. But it is possible that that kindergarten to grade 6 period could be an evaluation period to help determine what career path that they could be on, and or give them some options. Now, I know as a kid, I wanted to be a whole bunch of different things when I grew up. Not once did I ever say as a kid, oh, I want to be a homeless rights activist and advocate and podcaster. No, I did not want to be that as a kid, obviously. And I'm sorry to say, but that wasn't what I wanted to be as a kid. It's what I'm doing now, and it's absolutely what I love doing. I feel it's where I belong. But I don't think there's any junior high test or even elementary school test or even high school test that would have told me that. The only thing that told me that was living on the streets. That's where I learned some of those things. And there's some things that you're only going to get from the school of hard knocks. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't going to be concerns. I touched on them a little bit earlier. And part of those concerns do include the fact that these are charter schools, which means that these are going to be options for the people who want to pay $2,000, $3,000, $5,000, however much private school costs per year. It will vary from school to school. What also happens when a lot of these schools have that religious bias that sets up a very society-like attitude. And by society, I don't mean like we live in a society. I mean like societies like Scouts, Freemasons, those kind of things. The inner circle connection. And I don't want to talk conspiracy theorists here. I don't think there's like anything evil going on, but when we keep rich people in certain industries connected to other rich people in certain industries and pass that along to our children, that is where we get the class idealization from. This is where the one class begins to establish that it is superior and better to another class of people. This is where we get classism growing out of. And so we need to be careful how we approach this, because number one, the idea of being able to be trained to be a lawyer or a doctor or a banker from even a junior high age, if we're going to pretend that K to 6 is not actually going to be gearing people towards a specific path, but more like an evaluation period, which I hope it is, but I could very well be wrong. It could be as simple as, hey, my kid's going into kindergarten, make him a banker for me. But I realistically do not think it's going to be like that. If we go down that path where only the rich have that option, this is just another example of how people are born into something that's going to make them statistically more likely to succeed. And ideally, I don't want to begrudge the rich for being rich, but it makes it very, very difficult to do when they have all of these clear advantages and they can literally have mom and dad buy their way through life until they can become sustainable enough to buy their own way through life. Because that is something that 90% of Albertans do not have the option for. They don't get that chance. And a lot of it is left up to fate and determination and hard work. And yeah, I'm sure a lot of well-off children do still work hard. I'm not saying that they don't, but I'm saying that if someone who was born into a household that makes $15,000 a year works every bit as hard as someone who has all of these advantages, one of them is still going to be much better off than the other one. And that is where the problem is, because we keep saying, oh, if you just work hard, you can do anything. I bleed blue, and that's what happens when you're a hardcore conservative. But the fact is that there are people who are born with certain advantages and disadvantages. And we live in a society that evaluates that as saying this person is inherently better or not better. And vocational schools, vocational charter schools specifically, are going to make that even worse, because that just puts another tool in the pocket of those who can afford it that people who can't afford it don't have, and that people who can't afford it will never have access to that tool and never have access to that opportunity. And I've said it before a million times, I'm not for income equality. I don't want to take over the rich and guillotine them and force them to give all their wealth out to everybody else. That's just not how I roll. I sometimes make jokes about that, but really what I'd rather see is an equality of opportunity. I want to see a world where, regardless of your skin color, regardless of who you love, regardless of your ancestral history, regardless of your faith, and regardless of your income, if you work hard, you can be successful. And you don't have to work twice as hard as the next person, or 4 times as hard as the next person, or 8 times as hard as the next person. What I want to see is that equality of opportunity, and making sure that vocational schools, vocational charter schools are available as charter schools, which, might I add, still receive government funding. My taxes and your taxes still pay for them, and then they charge exorbitant fees on top of that. Flies in the face of making sure that everybody has that opportunity. What it does is it makes sure that the opportunity is only there for the people of a more wealthy birth. And I don't think that's the direction that our province should be heading into. That only creates disparity. It creates disparity economically. It creates disparity of opportunity. And what's going to happen when the economic disparity gap is so big that there's no more middle class? Businesses are going to crumble because no one's going to buy anything from the rich because they can't afford it. I know, I just took a sharp, strong, philosophical, economic philosophy turn there, but ultimately, society works best when everybody is granted the same opportunities. They can make with those opportunities what they will, and some of them will still fail on their own measure. And I do believe that we need some kind of social safety net to help those people, because a poor choice in life should not be a life sentence all of a sudden. I believe that we need to do more to ensure that everybody has the same opportunity to succeed, and vocational charter schools definitely interfere with that. Okay, our next topic for this week is going to be mandatory mask laws. Now, we've seen that there are a lot of businesses, and I've talked about this in previous episodes, that have implemented mandatory mask policies, and putting something like that into law complicates things even more, because we need to make sure that masks are in the hands of people in poverty. We need to make sure that masks are in the hands of the homeless community. Because if we don't, all a mask law is just another way to criminalize poverty. And I don't know how that can be much clearer. I know in Calgary, they started using transit to hand out masks. I still actually don't know how that's working, if that's through the Calgary Transit office or if they're on buses. It's been a while since I've ridden a bus, so I don't know. But it would be nice if, as rec centers started opening up, that they became available at the door there. And that we don't just rely on drive-thrus to hand them out. I do know city councillors have been handing them out. City councillors were actually given a whole bunch of masks for their offices as part of the province's distribution. So most of the councillors are be like, I'll keep a few around for my staff, but I don't need this much. So they've been giving them out to almost anyone who's called them. So if you need some disposable masks, these aren't like cloth masks or anything, they are disposable masks. If you need some, call your city councillor. But the big thing is we need to make sure that if we're going to implement any mandatory mask laws, whether it's as a provincial law or whether it's as a local bylaw, that masks are as readily and freely available, as barrier-free as possible before implementing such a thing. Because otherwise, we're just going to see more people in poverty go through the same BS cycle that I discussed last week. And I actually think I'm allowed to swear on here so long as I don't do it all the time. So I might keep that in mind for some of my topics in the future. That point, though, back to the point that I was making, is that I spent a whole segment last week talking about criminalizing poverty. And if we make sure that people in poverty can't afford masks, it's not even us making sure, it's through neglect. We end up having people in poverty not able to get masks when they need them, then that is essentially the same thing as making sure, because if we ignore a problem, we're making sure that it's not going to go away. So if we keep masks out of the hands of people in poverty, or we make them difficult for people in poverty to attain, then we're just going to end up seeing people in poverty getting fines, people in poverty getting carded, people in poverty going, oh, well, you've got warrants already, so we'll pick you up for those. Assuming that those are things that have been around since before the Bill 9, 2016. We're going to keep seeing people not able to get driver's license. We're going to keep seeing people having their wages garnished or not getting their full tax rebates. Because we've decided that we want to implement a system where we can have the poor pay for all the police's services. And I guess the province's services too, because the province is taking a larger cut of those fines now as well. So we can't be rushing into that. I am strictly opposed to mask laws. I'm not opposed to masks. I have a mask. I wear it frequently. If I'm just going for a walk, I don't. But if I'm going to the store or if I'm doing anything that requires me to ride a bus, I have a mask for those. I wear it. And I absolutely encourage all of my listeners to wear their masks as well. But I absolutely am opposed to mandatory mask laws, because all that's going to do is disproportionately impact negatively those who cannot get their hands on one. And I don't think people realize how much of a problem that actually is. There are avenues to get a small supply, but if you need a reusable mask, those aren't freely available. Those you have to pay for. And if stores are sold out of their masks, their disposable masks, and the province or the city or their supply is out or whatnot, you can't just call up your city councilor every 3 days and go, I need more masks so I can go about and do this. That's not a realistic option. So I think if we're going to make masks mandatory, we have to have people who can't afford them subscribe to them to have them mailed out to them on a regular basis. We need to be able to participate in society. We need to be able to do our grocery shopping. We need to be able to catch the bus places. Even just for mental health, forget the grocery shopping thing. We need to be able to participate in society for our mental health. And people don't realize just how taxing poverty already is on the mental health. So anything we can do to benefit that, it's probably a good thing and will definitely save the healthcare system more money in the long run. Now, granted, a whole bunch of people getting sick with COVID is not going to help that healthcare system. But we cannot expect people with barriers to be able to get these things that everybody else takes advantage of all the time. And I see it. I see it on my Facebook wall. All of my middle class friends pushing for mandatory mask laws, pushing for mandatory mask rules. And if you so much as speak up against that, you're like, oh, well, you're part of that COVID's not real conspiracy theory. Or what? Do you want to see someone get sick? Or were you willing to sacrifice your grandfather? Firstly, all of my grandparents have passed away, so I'm not sacrificing them. Secondly, if these masks were easily to access for everyone, and not just like a one-time easy to access, but if everyone could get the supply that they need to last them throughout the pandemic, I would be all in favor of it. But that's not realistic. Yes, I know there's a lot of places who are working hard to make sure that masks are available. I don't want to throw their work under the bus. Keep doing those things. But the idea of calling your city councilor on a weekly basis to get a week's supply of masks, that's not realistic for those of us who don't have vehicles to go through the drive-through. And I think that until we can't. I'm not even going to say. I was going to say until I think we can guarantee, but the fact is, I don't think we can. There will always be people who fall through the cracks, and I think that if they are so vulnerable that they are falling through these cracks, whatever the city's doing, whatever the province is doing, if these people are so vulnerable when they're falling through these cracks, then why are we going to punish them even further? If they are that vulnerable, or if there is that many barriers before them that they can't get these masks, why punish them even more? And I hate to break it to you, but there are people who are that vulnerable. There are people who would love a mask, but they are falling through the cracks because despite all of the answers we've tried coming up with, we can't get to 100%. And what's the ratio threshold? If there's 100 people in the province who are too vulnerable, is that acceptable? 300 people? 1,000 people? Where do we draw that line? I'd like to think, if we can get masks into the hands of 99.9% of the population, that should always be good enough. But I know that 3 years ago, I would have been in a situation where I was too vulnerable to get a mask. And I can't forget that part of my life. I can't forget how bad I was 3 years ago, how bad I was 5 years ago, how bad I was 10 years ago. I know that that could easily have been me if this happened 4 years ago, if this happened 8 years ago. And so maybe it's selfish of me to say, you shouldn't sacrifice my life for this. But that's where we're at. I got masks. I use them. Not everyone has that luxury. And while we're on this topic, I also want to mention one other thing about mask shaming. There are people with legitimate disabilities. I'm not talking your conspiracy theorist, yellow vester, COVID was invented by the government and 5G kind of guys. I'm not talking them. I'm talking that there are people with legitimate respiratory issues that prevent them from being able to wear a mask safely. Now, as I understand the law, and I'm not a legal expert, but as I understand the law, it's only expected that businesses make every reasonable attempt to serve these people. But the reasonable attempt might not hold up when it comes to against protecting all their other customers from a virus like the global health pandemic that we've been experiencing, because this video is going to go up onto YouTube. For those who are listening on your podcast listening devices, I do put these on YouTube, and I'm not allowed to mention that on YouTube. So we need to understand what's reasonable and what's not. And I don't know where that line should be. This is a conversation we need to have members of the disability community involved in. But I will say that mask shaming is not the answer. And that's not how you respond to it. So I absolutely encourage you to wear a mask. But if you have personal reasons for why you don't, and you're not some kooky conspiracy theorist, then I'm not going to complain. I do think that those of us who want to participate in society, though, need to make sure that we have our masks. And I do think we need to make sure we're not punishing those of us who are so vulnerable that we can't get them. It's about finding that balance. And remember, the whole reason why we're social distancing, the whole reason why we're encouraging people who can wear masks to wear masks, the whole reason why we had all of these businesses shut down is because we understand that we function as a society and that society has to work together. So we need to work together to find better solutions than mandatory mask laws. And we need to work together to find better solutions than punishing people with disabilities who might not be able to wear a mask. After all, we're all in the same storm. We should work on it together. Finally, in our last segment, we're going to touch on equalization. And the reason why we're kind of touching on this is I want to know if for some reason Alberta managed to pull out on equalization, where would that extra revenue go? How would it come back? Because I imagine what would happen, because we are still paying federal taxes and equalization comes out of our federal tax and our GST, that it would have to be sent to the province, which means that it still doesn't stay in the taxpayer's pocket. It's essentially the province taking a larger share of federal taxes. And I'm not sure if that's going to go to the services it's supposed to go to. It's going to go towards pet projects. It's going to go towards businesses It's certainly not going to help out anyone on the streets or anyone living in poverty because, God forbid, that would be communism. So I want to figure out what the intention of the equalization referendum is, because that's going to be coming up next year. And if you missed it earlier this week, Jason Kenney announced that there will be a referendum on equalization in Alberta next year. Now, I'm not naive. I think the vast majority of Albertans are going to say no to equalization. Not that they have a choice. It's written into the Constitution, and having things removed from the Constitution requires a lot of changes. It's going to require the consent of 7 out of 10 provinces, and I can't see anyone except Saskatchewan agreeing to that. And it's essentially just an exercise in fealty, because it seems as if our government doesn't know how equalization works. And considering that Jason Kenney himself was part of creating the current equalization formula, I would think he should know how it works. So either we have an extremely incompetent premier, or we have an extremely competent premier who believes that the voters in Alberta are idiots. And he says all the right things. And I don't want to trash talk Alberta voters, considering I just said I think the vast majority of Albertans are going to say no to equalization. But it's not going to accomplish anything. It's going to be a multi-million-dollar referendum with corporations and individuals donating money to their super PACs that have almost no limits or relatively high limits based on the rules that Kenney has set. And that's money that really could be going to bettering our communities. That's money that could be going towards enabling the homeless to vote, interestingly enough, because it's probably going to be happening at the same time municipal elections occur. And the homeless community needs to vote. It's something I've been working on for years now, is trying to rock the vote among the homeless community. Organizations that I am with have fought hard to try and get polling stations at shelters, whether it be in the municipal election, whether it be in provincial and federal elections, even in by-elections that have affected downtown. We've been working hard to try and encourage people who are homeless to vote. And our huge victory was when we got a polling station in a homeless shelter here in Calgary. And this is going to be a key issue. And this is one of those issues where I really hope that they start broadcasting the news in the shelters more often. Because I know when I was living in the shelters, it was hockey and American Movie Channel, or AMC, or whatever it's called. I think sometimes there was like Turner Broadcast Movies or something like that, but it was rarely ever was the news on. And I think this is going to be something that we're going to need to start paying attention to. And how do we distribute the literature for it? I mean, I've got a very, very clear bias, so anything that I present for it would have to be heavily redacted. So I'm not even touching creating that literature with a 10-foot pole. But it's going to be a difficult task, because now on top of trying to make sure all the information about candidates is available, we've got to make sure all the information regarding this referendum is available, and that we don't take sides in it, even though we know the entire thing is a sham. So this might actually be a project that I'll back out of and let other people run. I'll be more than glad to distribute the literature, but I definitely don't want to be part of making it, because I know I'm not reliable enough for that. But yeah, this is going to be a really big thing, and I think it's important that Albertans are paying attention and that Albertans start reading up on how equalization works and what would the options be if they decided that, yes, we can rewrite the Constitution and remove equalization from it, and figure out a plan for how that's going to work. And yeah, it seems like I've spent like 7 minutes just kind of rambling on and making the same point, but it's something that kind of scares me, is the fact that we're actually going to have a referendum on something that we cannot change, that we don't have the authority to change, and that the government has been lying to us about how it works. And yeah, I think that equalization does need to be changed. I seriously hope keep equalization, but change the formula is an option, because I do think that our province has been getting a raw deal, but we're also in the middle of a global recession right now, partially caused by COVID, but partially caused by tanking oil prices. And so keeping that in mind, we're still one of the strongest economies, like it or not, in this country. So there's very little we can do to actually benefit our province under equalization. And if you're a federalist, like Kenny keeps saying he is, then he should understand that Alberta has that responsibility, that Alberta, every province has to contribute to the country, and that those funds are used to the betterment of the country. Anyways, I know it's not super tied to poverty, although I did have a couple of comments on some of my concerns about how the information is going to be disseminated and all that stuff, but I figured I've got this podcast platform, I might as well rant about it for a little bit. And that concludes all of our regular segments. And finally, we have our lightning round segment. We're going to cover 4 topics. We're going to be brief, and we're going to go ahead with it. First topic, MyFair Transit app. Now, the MyFair Transit app seems like a pretty good idea. Most people have smartphones nowadays, and Calgary Transit has announced that they're going to be rolling out this app on July 1st. Now, my big concern about that, and while this doesn't directly tie to poverty, transit is a service that people in poverty use quite regularly, is, yes, because of the global pandemic, a lot of places are closed right now, a lot of events have been canceled, but people are still going to want to go out and do all sorts of things. And that means there's going to be barbecues and picnics, and I imagine Canada Day is going to be a very, very busy day for Calgary Transit users. And is the app going to be able to handle that stress of having it roll out day one on a holiday? Only time will tell. I certainly hope that they've done sufficient stress testing. And for those who aren't familiar with technology, stress testing is when you test to see just how much of a load the servers can bear. All of these apps have to go to a website which is hosted on a server, and servers can only handle so many visitors at one time. So we will see on Canada Day just how well the MyFair Transit app rolls out. I do know that whether it handles the stress of Canada Day or not, the stress will go down over time, but hopefully it will be ready to go by day one. Often the solution is buy more servers and increase your bandwidth plan if you are a hoster. So we will see how that goes. And congratulations to Calgary Transit for doing this. On a side note, an interesting bit of conversation was when we were pushing for the low income transit pass, part of that conversation also involved low income individual fares. And this was back when we only had the one low income bus pass that was at half price. And so now that we've got bus passes for as little as $5.40 a month, I think it is now, that's probably not going to be something that's going to be needed. But at the time, we were actually really trying to push for low income individual fares, and that was going to roll out with their previous electronic payment plan. So I'm not sure if that's still on the table, but it'd be very interesting if it was a possibility. There are some people who only ride the bus once or twice a month, but honestly, for those of us who are in the absolute lowest income bracket, 2 fares is 1 month plus some change back. So, next up, we move to Canada Day. As we had mentioned earlier, the MyFair Transit app is rolling out on Canada Day, so it seems like a nice, suitable segue. And I honestly have never been much for nationalism or patriotism. I don't think Canada's a horrible country, but I do think we need to be a little bit more honest about our history. And I also think it's kind of unusual to take a loyalty to a chunk of dirt with an imaginary border. I could love my country as much as I want, but my country is not going to love me back. It's land that has a line drawn around it because everybody on the planet agrees where that line should go. So that's kind of my thoughts on it. I do hope everyone has a happy Canada Day. I hope they enjoy it. I hope they have fun. I hope they get to spend time with their family and do things that they want to do. But I'm not as enthusiastic about it. I'm not the most patriotic or nationalistic person. So, yeah. Major sporting events in Alberta. NHL Hub, World Cup of Soccer. This is kind of interesting conversation here because over the next several years, Edmonton's going to be hosting a bunch of major sporting events. At least 2 come to mind if our premier gets his way. If the premier gets his way, the first one that will be happening will be NHL games at Edmonton. Now, that doesn't seem like a new thing. Edmonton already hosts an NHL team. But with the global pandemic going on, the NHL is looking at selecting a few cities to host its playoff games at instead of having it all home team, away team, and going all over to all 16 teams that normally qualify for the playoffs. In this modified playoff version, there's going to be, I believe, 24 teams participating, and they will do their games in a handful of different arenas, and there's a push to have Edmonton be one of the host cities. So you're going to see a lot of people coming in to play these hockey games. I don't imagine there's going to be any game attendance. It's just going to be the games played. And then in 2026, Edmonton will also be hosting a few of the games for the World Cup soccer. And that's a really big event. I can't remember the last time that that North America hosted the World Cup. I believe it was the States. Well, technically Mexico, but America and Canada aren't known as soccer countries or football countries. So we don't normally get to host these things. So this is going to be a big deal. You're going to have people from all over the world coming to see these games. And my concern is with the additional attention these events are going to be getting is the impact that is going to have on the homeless community. We already saw people who are in poverty gentrified out of their affordable housing projects when the Rogers Center opened, or whatever Edmonton's new hockey arena is, as well as additional sweeps were going on at that time, from what I heard. And I imagine with a huge event like World Cup soccer, there's never been a World Cup that didn't involve mass sweeps of the homeless community, as well as efforts to gentrify neighborhoods around where the game is going to be held to make sure that they're nice, rich neighborhoods. That happens with almost every World Cup event. That happens with almost every Olympics. It's one of the reasons why I was staunchly opposed to the Olympics coming to Calgary, is because that happened in Calgary last time. That also happened in Vancouver. That happened in Japan. It's happened in every country that hosts the Olympics. And even when Calgary hosted it last time, we only had a homeless population of about 200, according to our counts at around that time, 150 to 200. But many students lost their housing because they were all evicted from their housing to make room for the media to reside there when there wasn't enough space available in the Olympic Village. So major events like this tend to have a negative impact on the homeless and people who are in poverty. So I have that huge concern, and I really think that discussions about how to host these events need to be done in collaboration with people who are in poverty, people who are homeless, and housing and service providers. Finally, our last lightning round topic is Alberta militias. This is just going to be a really quick bite here because Alberta militias don't normally have anything to do with poverty. But there is going to be a small point to this. I'm actually not opposed to it so long as it's regulated. It's registered and regulated. Earlier last week, the legislature passed a bill saying that I believe it was the Justice Minister, it may have been someone else, would explore citizen police forces, which is essentially a militia. And there have been militias that have done horrible, horrible things. There's a huge history of racism in militias. There have been some militias who have done amazing things, and community policing isn't actually a bad idea. Having the community replace police officers isn't a bad idea if we're talking to fund the police, so long as, they are adequately trained. And by adequately trained, I mean better trained than our current police officers are. And so long as they have a non-militia-like goal, just like any charter club. A good example is the Black Panther Party. In fact, most states in the United States that have gun control laws specifically put those laws in to target the Black Panthers. But in addition to being an armed militia, the Black Panthers also opened community centers, they fed the poor, they created school programs, and they actually de-escalated gang violence. So, do I think something like that could happen in Alberta? I'm skeptical because it is Alberta. We are a very, very redneck province with racist roots that we are still having difficulties confronting. But there is that flip side as well. So long as they are an organized group, a registered society, and have non-weapons related community improvement goals as part of their charter, I think it could actually be good. I'm not saying it will be good. I'm very, very skeptical it will be good, and I'm very skeptical that it will be regulated like any other society should. But I'm not willing to just completely write it off just yet. So we'll wait and see. It's definitely not the route that I want to go. I'm just trying to think of potential positives here. Thank you for listening to PovPolPodcast. I've been your host, Nigel Kirk. If you enjoy what you've heard, please subscribe on your preferred podcast platform and give us a thumbs up on YouTube or a positive rating on your listening service. Also, please consider supporting me and supporting the project on Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/PovPolPodcast. If you have topics you'd like to hear about or lightning round suggestions, please email them to povpolpodcast@gmail.com. The music used for the podcast is Poor Boy by Pedro Santiago and is under a Creative Commons license.